When the Mexican War came to a close, the build up to the Civil War immediately begins. We had had, up until this time, a growing division in the country over the differences between the North, an industrialized society, and the South, which was an agricultural society. On top of that, we had the major issue of slavery, which was dividing the country, and a growing abolitionist movement was strengthening the divide between the southern and the northern states. But when the Mexican War broke out, the vast majority of Americans were in favor of gaining new territory. The problem was, now that we had gained this new territory, is it going to be open to slavery or not? The territories between Texas and California, all of this had been added by our victory in the Mexican War. And so now the question was, would California and those other territories be open to slavery? The good news, we thought, was that, okay, we may have a difference of opinion over this, but it will be decades before anybody's living out there in large enough numbers to actually turn these areas into states. But we were wrong. In 1848, gold is discovered at Sutter's Mill in California, and suddenly people rush across the country to get to California, and that state fills up with people, and it's ready to be a state. No more waiting. They want to be a state. And the United States has to make a decision. Will California be free or slave? Well, California had mostly filled up with people hunting gold, and people who own lots of slaves generally don't have to go looking for gold because they're already rich. So California is not going to be a slave state. But Southerners, remember, there's an equal number of free and slave states in the Senate. Southerners are not going to approve a free state of California coming into the Union. So we have an impasse. And there's a lot of debate and argument. Ultimately, our old friend Henry Clay, the guy who had worked out the Compromise of 1820, the guy who had worked out the compromise over the tariff crisis during Jackson's administration, he's now going to step in one more time and work out a compromise towards the end now of his career. And so Clay does a lot to engineer this compromise, and we're going to see both sides have to give in a little. First of all, California will be a free state, but the South has to get something for that. So we're going to open those two territories, Utah and New Mexico, to slavery under a system called popular sovereignty. Now you notice all this area up here in pink. Those territories had been closed forever to slavery by the Compromise of 1820, the Missouri Compromise, which had allowed Missouri in as a slave state and then had drawn a line right here saying states below could be slaves, states above would be free. But now these states out here, these territories, they're going to be open to slavery. And when enough people are living there, under this system called popular sovereignty, they'll have a popular vote. And if the people in this new state want to be slave, it'll be a slave state. If they want to be free, it'll be a free state. The South takes this. That's the best they're going to get. They're hoping that these territories will fill up with slave owners, and these will become future slave states and maintain that balance between free and slave states. They also make a couple of other compromises at that time. Northerners were highly embarrassed by the fact, abolitionists were embarrassed by the fact that the slave trade was still going on in our nation's capital. Diplomats from other countries who had banned slavery would walk down the streets of Washington, D.C. and see slave auctions going on. So Southerners agreed to end the slave trade. Now, you could still own slaves in D.C., but slave auctions could no longer take place in D.C. if Northerners would agree to enforce stricter fugitive slave laws. When slaves escaped and ran up north to free soil, Northerners by law were required to return that property to their owners. So the North agrees to this. But as we're going to see, once these fugitive slave laws actually do go into effect, you're going to see Northerners comply to a certain degree, but then we're going to see Northerners resist. There's cases where Northerners would cooperate with slave catchers, and they would round up slaves that had been captured in a northern city and house them in the jail. And then when the slave catchers would try to take them to the port to ship them down south, they would be attacked by a mob, and the slaves would get away. And you saw this kind of thing happen. So there were plenty of people up north that wanted to subvert these laws even after they were put in place. But this was the compromise. Also at that time, that's when they made the agreement, just for us Texans, to saw off that big hunk of Texas that had stretched all the way up to what is now Wyoming. We sold that off in exchange for $10 million that we could use to pay off the rest of Texas' debts from our own period as a nation. So also it's this time period when Texas gets its modern shape. Okay, so the Compromise of 1850 settles things down. And we breathe a sigh of relief. We think, okay, we can move forward, and most Americans that don't want to fight over slavery, we can put our head back in the sand and forget about it. But it's not going to be that easy. See, out there in California, there was a lot of business to be had, a lot of gold to be had, and there was a need to build a railroad across the country. And the problem is with the railroad, everywhere the railroad goes, little towns are going to pop up, people are going to move in, and that territory will be ready to be a state. And up in Chicago, the people up there wanted a railroad that went across this territory of Kansas and Nebraska and on to California. Now, the problem was Kansas would not be open to slavery and would come in as a free state. So Southerners are not going to vote to put a railroad through that territory. However, Stephen Douglass, a very influential senator from Illinois, he comes up with an idea. His idea is going to result in the Kansas-Nebraska Act. And what the Kansas-Nebraska Act is going to say, I'm trying to get my slide to, there it goes. What the Kansas-Nebraska Act is going to say is, all right, we're going to open this territory to popular sovereignty. And he tells Northerners, don't worry about it, because you know what? Cotton doesn't grow this far north. It's going to end up being a free territory anyway, but the Southerners will vote for it, and we'll get our railroad, and then we'll still get a free state. And he was right. Ultimately, Southerners went for it because they were desperate for new areas open to slavery to try to maintain that balance. But the railroad went through. It filled up with people. The vast majority did not own slaves. And so Douglass was almost right. There's one thing he didn't count on, and that was the way the elections went there in Kansas. First of all, they held an election to decide what type of state it would be and to elect a government. And although the vast majority of people in Kansas did not own slaves and were against slavery, it voted to be a slave state. But then they took a look at how many people had voted and realized there's a lot more votes here than there are people in Kansas. Because down in the little southeastern corner of the state where there were slave owners, they had invited their slave-owning friends across the state line from Missouri to come vote in the election. This was an illegal election, but they had voted to be a slave state. Well, the folks up in Kansas, they decided, nope, this isn't going to work. We're going to have to do this again. But they didn't want folks from Missouri showing up, so they didn't invite the southeastern counties of Kansas to take part in this election, and they voted to be a free state and chose an abolitionist governor. So now you have two governments that have been elected. One is asking Congress to recognize Kansas as a free state. One's asking it to recognize Kansas as a slave state. And both governments are elected illegally. One because too many people voted, and the second was illegal because they didn't let everybody vote. Well, Congress argues over which one is the rightful government of Kansas. And in Kansas, they argue over it, and ugly words are exchanged, and ultimately tensions flare up. And a group of pro-slavery folks get sick and tired of the ugly things being printed about them in a newspaper from Lawrence, Kansas. So a group of them grabbed their guns, rode up to Lawrence, Kansas, smashed the newspaper, and terrorized the town. This first Lawrence raid starts this thing we're going to call Bleeding Kansas. Now, the only person to actually get hurt in this first raid was one idiot that was with the group that decided to try to blow up a building by putting a cannon next to it, and he made the building, part of the building collapse on him. He was the only one hurt. There will be another raid on Lawrence, Kansas later on that will be a lot worse during the Civil War, but it had started the violence. Now, as soon as these pro-slavery folks had attacked a free soil town, well, there's going to be some retaliation, and the fellow in the picture here is an abolitionist by the name of John Brown. He's pretty hardcore. He believes that slavery is wrong and that God has given him the mission of ending slavery, and he is to fight physically, violently, to end slavery, and ultimately he believes that the only way it's going to end is through a great slave uprising where this country will pay for its sin of slavery through the shedding of blood. And, well, he's very nearly right. Ultimately, it will be an awful, bloody civil war before this country will finally end slavery. So he's looking to make that civil war happen. He is looking for violence. And when this raid on Lawrence, Kansas happens, he and some of his sons and a couple of followers, they go down to a little part of Kansas in the pro-slavery area called Pottawatomie Creek, and they attack several families. First family they come upon, they ride up to the family homestead, and they drag this pro-slavery father and his sons out and smash in their skulls and chop them in little pieces in front of Ma and the daughters. And then they go up the creek and they do that to a couple of other families. So he is slaughtering people. And, well, as soon as he does this, then the pro-slavery folks are going to make another raid. And then the free soilers are going to make another raid. And Kansas now is in full-blown civil war. And that's the way it's going to stay for the next several years until the actual Civil War begins. And what's worse, not only do we have a territory that is having an outright civil war, but people in the North and people in the South are taking sides. Not just taking sides, but collecting money and supplies to send to Kansas to kill their fellow Americans over this issue of slavery. So the war has begun out there. Well, meanwhile, back east, more developments are moving us closer and closer to the Civil War. One of them, and usually, more than likely, if you're watching this video, you probably have an assignment to read a section of Uncle Tom's Cabin. Uncle Tom's Cabin is a book. Actually, it was a serial published in newspapers and then eventually assembled into a book, written by Harriet Beecher Stowe. And the idea of Uncle Tom's Cabin was she was arguing against slavery by telling the story of Uncle Tom and a number of other slaves, which are going to suffer the injustices that are part of slavery. And she's going to try to do this in a way that she's able to argue against every form of slavery. So she's not going to just have them with an evil master beating them. Well, yes, people have heard of that, and the South will just say, well, we don't do that. That's rare that anyone would go that extreme. That's the exception. So she can't just show that. And she can't just show the average master. She's got to show the kind, gentle master, which, most Southern masters are going to claim they are. Oh, I'm benevolent. I take care, the paternalistic obligation to care for their slaves. Well, I care for my slaves. So she's going to have Uncle Tom in this story start on an average plantation master's homestead, and it'll show one of the biggest evils of slavery right up front when they fall on financial hard times, and the master has to sell Uncle Tom down the river to another plantation, and he's separated from his wife and kids. So you've seen the hard work, you've seen the lack of freedom, you've seen separation from their family. Then he's sold down to New Orleans, and he's bought by arguably a kind master who treats his slaves well. But during this part of the book, she's showing that even under that situation, he's not free. There's still injustices. There's a lot of conversations here where people debate the merits of slavery. And ultimately, the master decides he's going to let Uncle Tom be free. But before he can sign the papers, he is killed and his property is sold off. And so now Uncle Tom goes to be with the evil master, Simon Legree, who eventually has him beaten to death. Now, while he's being beaten to death, Uncle Tom, a Christian man, is praying for his master's soul. And so Uncle Tom's portrayed as a human, as a Christian. And the other slaves are portrayed as human. You start to feel for their plight. And this book was powerful. It presented slavery in a very personable way. And it started to get people who were apathetic and just didn't care one way or another to start to say, hey, slavery's wrong. I'm an abolitionist. So the abolitionist movement is growing. And this book is banned down south because it's so detrimental to the institution of slavery. So we're having further division caused by this book. In fact, the book is so powerful that supposedly when Abraham Lincoln met Harriet Beecher Stowe during the Civil War, he's supposed to have said, so you're the little woman who started this big war. So the book had an impact. Another thing that's going to have an impact is the continual escape of slaves. The Underground Railroad has been organized, and there are a network of African Americans and other Americans, Quakers especially up in Pennsylvania were a big part of this. They're going to help slaves escape. The most famous conductor, of course, of the Underground Railroad, Harriet Tubman, she is going to, after she gets her own freedom, she's going to go back again and again and lead other slaves miraculously to freedom, risking her own life, her own freedom. And so we're going to see people stealing the property, as far as the law was concerned, of Southern plantation owners, helping these slaves escape. And that's going to cause further tensions between North and South, because the North isn't enforcing those fugitive slave laws. In the midst of all this, the tensions and the violence are going to, like we said, there's going to be people taking sides, North and South. And famously, Harriet Beecher Stowe's father, the Reverend Beecher, he would go around the North giving sermons about the evils of slavery and take up collections in church to buy Bibles. In this case is the Bibles that he would buy. He would buy cases of guns and ammunition to go kill pro-slavery folks, and then they'd cover them with Bibles and market Bibles to maybe get it through the mail to where it was going. But that's what we're doing, both North and South. We're supplying that war. But the violence isn't just out in Kansas. The violence is eventually going to spill out onto the floor of the United States Senate. Charles Sumner was a senator from the North, and Senator Brooks from South Carolina had given a speech in favor of slavery. Then Sumner got up and he gave a speech against the evils of slavery, and he made some personal remarks against Senator Brooks. Well, of course, for a Southerner, a personal insult is going to require a duel or some kind of, retaliation. But while he was giving his speech, Senator Brooks had a young nephew across the hall in the House of Representatives. So some of the Southern senators got up, they walked across the hall while Sumner was still speaking, and they told young Mr. Brooks, you should hear what they're saying about your uncle. So he gets up during the sessions of Congress, and he walks across the hall. And by this time, Sumner is now sitting back in his desk. Someone else is giving a speech, but he walks up to Sumner, knocks him to the floor, and starts beating him violently with his cane. And if you can see the picture, it's a little hard to see probably, but you can see some of the senators back there are laughing, smiling, because they're Southerners and they think he deserves it. And over here you can see there's a Southerner with his cane blocking Northerners from breaking up the fight. This was a brutal assault. He was beaten into a coma. And when he does regain consciousness, he's going to have to relearn to speak and to walk. This was a horrible assault. And it happens on the Senate floor with some people supporting it. Now across the hall in the House of Representatives, the North, who controlled the House, voted to kick Brooks out of the House of Representatives. And he was sent home to South Carolina. And South Carolina was told they had to vote and pick someone to replace, to fill that seat. And they just voted him right back into that seat. And before he came back north to retake his position in the House, they gave him a gift, another cane with a little message inscribed on it, basically saying, go beat some sense into some more Yankees. So things are getting really ugly. In the midst of all that, we have a major court ruling, the case of Dred Scott. Dred Scott had been a slave of an army surgeon, and he had followed his master from post to post, both in slave territories and in free states. When his master died, he sued for his freedom and got some people to support it to test this idea. And the argument was because he had been held in slavery on free soil where slavery didn't exist, he was therefore free. The Supreme Court, however, was full of Southerners. And the Supreme Court, first of all, they ruled that they couldn't hear the case because he wasn't an American citizen. And that sounds like it's a dodge where they're avoiding controversy. But no, they won't hear the case officially. But then they go ahead and say what they would have ruled if they had have heard the case, which stirs up more trouble. They say, look, here's the deal. He is property, and the Constitution protects people's property. Therefore, truly, there's no such thing as a free state. A slave is your property wherever you go. So, of course, the North does not like this ruling, and it causes even more tensions and more bitterness. And things are just getting worse. And we're seeing continued debate and discussion about the issue of slavery. There are spokesmen. One of the best spokesmen against the evils of slavery is a former slave himself, Frederick Douglass. And he's giving speeches, stirring up crowds, inspiring people to join the abolitionist movement. In Illinois, Stephen Douglas, the guy whose brilliant idea caused Kansas, he's now running for re-election. And this new political party that has been formed in the 1840s, the Republicans, they only have one thing they stand for, and that's stopping the spread of slavery. That's the whole plank in their platform. And they pick Abraham Lincoln to run against Douglas. Douglas and Lincoln have a series of debates across Illinois where Lincoln argues against the evils of slavery. Douglas argues his Freeport doctrine that, hey, places like Kansas, where slavery might be legal, all you have to do to keep it out is just don't pass laws to arrest slaves, and slavery can't work there. So he comes up with his little answer to the problem he had caused. But Lincoln didn't win the election, but Lincoln got famous through the speeches that he gave, and ultimately that's going to, 2 years later, make him the choice of the Republicans to run for national office as president. Still, the Republicans, they shouldn't win. Their party's still small compared to the large Democratic Party. The Whig Party is dying out at this point, and the Democrats is the party of the United States. They should win easily in 1860. However, right before the election, there's one more little incident that really stirs things up. John Brown, now with the big bushy beard, shows up again. This time not on the frontier, out in the Wild West, where you might expect people might get slaughtered. He shows up in the civilized East in Virginia, in a little town called Harper's Ferry, where he believes that he and his followers are supposed to capture a building, a federal arsenal, full of guns and ammunition, hand them out to the local slaves who will then kill their masters, and then hand them off to the slaves in the next county who will kill their masters, and the revolt will spread throughout the South, and the proponents of slavery will be killed, slaves will free themselves, and America will pay for its sin of slavery with the shedding of blood. And he believes this is God's will. So he goes, and he and his followers capture the federal arsenal, but instead of it working out, they are attacked and captured by a contingent of United States Marines. He has attacked a federal arsenal, which is an act of treason, and he is put on trial for treason. And the trial is the trial of the century. Everyone's following it. And he, John Brown, is able to get up and defend himself and give eloquent speeches against the evils of slavery. And Southerners, they hate this guy. He wanted us murdered. That's what he wanted happening to us Southerners. So he is the devil. But up north, he's fighting to end slavery. He's a saint. And so the division on this man, John Brown, just gets worse and worse. Well, he is condemned to death. And on the day he is executed up north, they hang black crepe paper in mourning in the cities. They ring church bells. They eulogize him. They write songs about him. They make him a martyr. And that just tells the South that the North would just as soon see all us Southerners dead. So as we enter the election of 1860, Southerners, they can't trust a government run by the North because the North not only wants to end slavery, but would just as soon see all the white Southerners dead. I mean, that's the way the John Brown incident makes it seem. So it's a very tense election. The election of 1860, well, the Republicans, they picked Lincoln, but they're not going to win. The Democrats will win. But the problem is in the Democratic Party, Southern Democrats, they don't just need somebody who's open to the existence of slavery. They must have a Southerner to protect them in the White House. So the Democratic Party split. Northerners, they went with Douglass because Douglass was a moderate and he was open to slavery, but he was kind of a compromise sort of guy. But Southerners said, no, he's not one of us. We must have a Southerner. And so the Southern Democrats wanted Breckinridge as their candidate. And the big Democratic Party vote is going to be split. And on top of that, then out in Tennessee, they see trouble coming. And so they form a new little party, the Constitutional Union Party, where they basically say, let's just say slavery's always going to be here. We're not going to get rid of slavery, and let's quit fussing about it because they just don't want a war. So the vote is split. And when the vote is split, the Republicans voting together win. And Lincoln becomes the president, a guy who is against the spread of slavery and ultimately against slavery itself. Southerners are uncomfortable with this. So at this point, we're going to see down in South Carolina in December, they have a vote, and the state of South Carolina chooses to secede from the Union. Now, the thing is, the Constitution does not directly address secession. When we were putting the country together, nobody was coming up with a plan to take it apart. So the Constitution does not expressly say that you can't leave the Union. It also does not say you can leave the Union. So this was still very unclear. But South Carolina is going to test it. They vote to secede from the Union. And as soon as South Carolina votes to secede from the Union, Georgia, Florida, Alabama, Mississippi, Louisiana, and Texas, the states furthest from northern states, they all secede. And in February of 1861, they form a new country, the Confederate States of America, one in which the central government will not be given as much power as the government of the United States had. States will retain a lot of their power, a lot of their rights. And this Confederacy is expressly in favor of preserving the institution of slavery. Now, other states that are slave states like Arkansas, Tennessee, North Carolina, Virginia, Missouri, Kentucky, and Delaware and Maryland, they know they're going to be the battlegrounds. They know if there's a civil war, the fight's going to be right there where they live. And they're a little hesitant to secede. But the 7 states that have seceded so far, they form the Confederacy. They inform federal authorities there, Union troops that are in their states, to leave, and they repossess public territory for the states. And out in South Carolina, in Charleston, there's a little fort in the harbor. The commander of the troops, Major Anderson, withdrew his troops from the city of Charleston. He didn't want to start a civil war. He didn't want violence to break out between his federal troops and the people now that the state had seceded. But he doesn't want to leave either because he hasn't been ordered to. So he withdraws his people from the city. He puts them in a fort in the middle of the harbor. But the state orders him to leave. We're no longer part of the U.S. That is now South Carolina's territory. And he says, no, you don't have the right to leave. The United States is who I work for, and I'm not leaving. So they give him a deadline. And when he doesn't leave by the deadline on April 12, 1861, they begin bombarding the fort. The South is fired first. The fort is surrendered. The Civil War has begun. And so now both sides, North and South, begin forming armies and preparing for this long, bloody struggle which will rip this country apart.